estét kívánok! Szűcs Dóra vagyok, üdvözlök mindenkit a Matthias Corvinus Kollégium és a Danube Institute közös szervezésében megvalósuló beszélgetés sorozat, a Patriotic Talks mai adásán. Az elmúlt hetekben a patriotizmus fogalmát, a nemzetállamok szerepét, valamint a politikai korrektség kérdését jártuk körbe kiváló hazai és nemzetközi szakértőkkel, döntéshozókkal. Our panel today will focus on patriotism in the light of globalization and will be moderated by Attila Demkó, head of the Center for Geopolitics at Matthias Corvinus Collegium. Attila, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dory. Thank you very much for the floor. And now it is my honor to introduce Douglas Murray. If he needs any introduction, I think everybody knows him since he wrote his bestseller, The Strange Death of Europe. He's the one who can take on the groupthink in the West so eloquently as nobody else. So, Douglas, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, I'm Douglas Murray, and it's a great pleasure to be back speaking for and to the MCC in Budapest, albeit this time virtually. But it's a huge honor and a great privilege once again to be speaking for the MCC, and particularly on such an important subject as the subject of this discussion. Patriotism and globalization, specifically patriotism in the light of globalization. I just wanted to make a few opening remarks on this for no more than 10 minutes. The first is on this. Every country in the world is suffering from some version of the same debate on this question, on the question of globalization, what its limits may be, and on patriotism, which includes national belonging, and where its limitations and borders indeed may be. But the country which is clearly going through this at the highest decibel is the United States of America. And since I've just returned from 5 weeks in the US, I wanted to throw out a few opening observations which pertain to this question, in particular in relation to the US. The recent American election and the run-up to it has been perhaps the highest decibel version of the patriotism and globalism debate that has occurred so far in our lifetimes. And if I were to put a single, not just day, but a moment on that, I would ask everyone to cast their minds back to the 4th of July of this year. Now, the 4th of July is, of course, a crucial, indeed sacred day in the American national calendar. But this year there was something different about the 4th of July. What is ordinarily a unalloyed celebration of patriotic sentiment, independence of the United States of America, became perhaps the most fraught Independence Day to date. And there are two things that I wanted to point to which can throw some light on this. The first is the reaction against the day, and the second is the reaction in defense of it. Now, of course, in the era of Donald Trump, reactions and counter-reactions all get melded up in each other. But here's what happened. The president himself decided to give a keynote, and you could arguably say historic speech about American history, about the patriotic sentiment that the American people have a right to feel. Now, he did this at Mount Rushmore in front of the carved statues, the statues carved into the mountains of four great US presidents. And on that occasion, he gave a speech in which he wanted to remind American citizens of their history. He said in very clear terms, and it was a very clear speech, and it's well worth reading for anyone who hasn't. He said very clearly what American history is and what the site that he was speaking in front of commemorated. He gave potted histories of the life of George Washington, of Thomas Jefferson, and so on. Now, this was a very remarkable thing because what he was saying was not at all new, but it did seem in some ways fresh. Why did it seem fresh? Because, as the president alluded to in his speech, in recent years, and you could argue for 2 generations of American students, the founding stories of their nation have been taught in a state of negativity and of very serious criticism. And President Trump wanted to try to rescue back. He said this was his stated objective. He wanted to try to wrestle that narrative back from the, you might say, postmodernists, the deconstructionists, and much more. And his speech was a straightforward history lesson, really, about the 4 remarkable men who stood behind him. Now, that was the first remarkable thing about the day. But the second thing, which I wanted to mention, is in some ways more remarkable still, which is the fact that the president was preparing to give a speech at Mount Rushmore on the 4th of July, seemed to drive a certain type of his critic absolutely wild with rage. There were broadcast journalists, print journalists, and much more who, not content with criticizing the president's motives or the specifics of his own attitudes, character, or policies, decided to run precisely at the thing that the president was saying that he himself was defending. Now, that perhaps reached a pitch, the highest pitch, with one of the broadcasters from one of the main networks in America, it happened to be CNN, saying to camera that tonight, she said, the president of the United States is going to be giving a speech on, quote, stolen land in front of the likenesses of slave owners. It requires a beat to recognize what is being said here, that Mount Rushmore is stolen land, and that 4 of the greatest presidents, including founding fathers of the United States, are simply to be regarded as slave owners and nothing more. Now, this to my mind, was one of the key battleground days, one of the most high-pitched days in this recent debate over globalism, over patriotism, where they're in contradiction, and what a reasonable balance might be between them. Now, of course, since that speech, it seems that the presidential election has seen Donald Trump's opponents winning. And I think, therefore, this is a particularly good time for us all to be gathering, to be thinking about these questions of patriotism, globalism, where the limits of both may run, where the good and virtuous bits of each may run, and where they may indeed run out. I say this is an important moment because, of course, the Biden-Harris transition team has already said, and they said during the presidential run, that they much favor globalized answers to questions that Donald Trump looked at in a far more national light. There are several ways in which they've done that. One is to highlight what may be said to be the sort of absolute central globalization conundrums, particularly, of course, I'm thinking of climate change. But there are other examples that they gave as well. Biden-Harris have repeatedly said that they wish to look to not just multinational, but to globalized answers to the problems that their own country faces. And of course, because of the power of American hegemony, because of the power of American military and cultural might, what happens in Washington has an impact very much further afield. I just wanted to say a few things before I wrap up these closing remarks. The first is this: of course, multinational solutions are not the same as globalist solutions. And this is something which I think we're going to have to tease out in our deliberations, and we're going to have to start to address more clearly. You can have multinational organizations that do not have to be globalist in their remit. You can have multinational entities and agreements and treaties and much more that do not have to go down a globalization route. And that's the first thing that I think needs to be considered when we're going over these issues. But another point is this, and this is really the key thing that I'd like to address. Patriotism in Europe perhaps particularly in continental Europe, as we think of it in the UK, patriotism in continental Europe comes with a significant amount of baggage. And I don't need to tell the assembled audience what that baggage is. We all know it. We've all lived our whole lives with it and in the knowledge of it. Patriotism, we know where it can go wrong, and we also know where it can go right. And as I've said in my previous occasion speaking with the MCC, this is not an unusual conundrum. Absolutely everything can go wrong. There's no reason to regard patriotism simply because it can go wrong as therefore being wrong in itself, any more than saying that because love caused the Trojan Wars, love in itself is wrong. It's a deep fallacy that people have fallen into, particularly in post-1945 Europe. But the point that we need to address and to think about, I think, and I hope we can, is this. If everything can go wrong, and we know where patriotism can go wrong, and I think we as Europeans do know very well what the warning signs are where patriotism goes wrong, where, for instance, people start playing games of not just pride, but superiority, and in the end, ethnic superiority, and much more. That is the borderline where we know that patriotism can go wrong. The question that seems to me very worth trying to address is, where is it that globalism goes wrong? Because there must be a borderline where it does. There must be identifiable times where it does. I could point, for instance, I would point to the recent troubles that our own continent has gone through with the coronavirus. There have been advantages to the multilateral approaches. There have also been very clear times when countries, I'm thinking particularly, of course, of France and Germany at the very beginning of the crisis, when the Mediterranean countries were having trouble even accessing things like ventilators, and Germany and France suddenly went unilateral, exceptionally fast, and started to draw up effectively their own export borders. I wonder whether we couldn't recognize this as one of the examples of where the globalism thing can go wrong, where actually you arrive very sharp and fast at a limit that you pretended didn't exist, that you arrive swiftly at a reality that everybody had been pretending hitherto was not there. So I said I would only be about 10 minutes in these opening remarks, but I just want to leave us with that question. Where can globalism go wrong? Where does it go wrong? If we can answer that question, then we can more adequately and fruitfully address the whole question of patriotism, globalism, and the relation between the two. Thank you.
I guess this keynote speech was very comprehensive, maybe too comprehensive, as it really covered all my questions I wanted to ask. But still, I think there are three main issues which we can elaborate a little bit further. But before doing that, I would like to introduce our great panel. Unfortunately, they are not here in person, but I think we can make this event as interesting as a real conference would have been. So let me welcome our panelists. From the United States, we have Christopher Buskirk, founder and editor of the journal American Greatness. From Switzerland, Andreas Glarner is with us. He is a member of parliament and an expert of his party, the Swiss People's Party, on migration and asylum. From France, Grégor Puppinck is our guest. He is the director of the European Center for Law and Justice. And last but not least, from Hungary, Miklós Szánthó, director of the Center for Fundamental Rights. So let's start with the issue of globalization versus patriotism. Globalization is often portrayed in almost exclusively positive terms, while countries where patriotism has a visible renaissance, like in Hungary, are mostly labeled as nests of extreme nationalism by the mainstream media. Some, however, say that globalization in its current form creates more conflict than it solves. So would globalization lead to a big, happy, liberal global village? And is patriotism obsolete or even dangerous?
Yeah, well, to give you the short answer, though I'll give you a longer one too. The answer is no, it certainly isn't dangerous, just the opposite. In fact, it has a number of beneficial, of salutary benefits for the people of, say, Hungary or the United States or any of the nations that have started to rethink globalization versus the interests of their citizens. And that's really sort of the key framing as far as I'm concerned, which is, what is it the job of government to do? Is government's job to serve the interests of its citizens in particular, to put the interests of the citizens, for instance, of Hungary first above the interests of the citizens of any other country, or in the United States, for the American government to put the interests of American citizens first? And I think the answer is obviously yes. I mean, that's just that's the common sense answer. And for the past, sort of a century, but definitely since the end of World War II, there's been this push towards, the kind of the globalist utopia. But the globalist utopia isn't a place that a lot of people find that they want to live. It's a place where government actually increasingly serves the interests of a smaller and smaller elite, where wealth concentrates in the hands of a very few people, and where the middle class in our countries grows smaller, where their hold on the middle class lifestyle grows more precarious. And so that's why I think we've seen an increase in popularity for leaders who are called ultra nationalists, which really, the translation of that is just a leader who is interested in the middle class instead of the big corporations and in the global Davos class.
In my opinion, globalization has brought an undeniable advantage in terms of the exchange of goods and services. Yet every government has a duty to care for its own country and people, because only when your country is doing well and your people are doing well, it is in a good position to help other countries. Everything else is socialism, but history has taught us that then not everyone is equally good, everyone is equally bad.
But a very interesting development is occurring as we speak, which is this. French patriotism is something that has always been strong. It has always existed in France and perhaps has been misunderstood outside France. But the misunderstanding is being cleared up to some extent as we speak. On the day we speak, Emmanuel Macron has done something quite remarkable. He has phoned up and criticized the New York Times, and he has written a letter which was published yesterday in the Financial Times of London. Both these interventions by the French president complain against these very, I don't want to use the term liberal, I don't like it in these terms, but self-described liberal left-wing publications. The president of France has attacked these publications for misrepresenting the nature of the French state, of French laïcité, secularism, and indeed patriotism. And this is a very interesting moment for several reasons. One is it highlights the fact that something has gone particularly off with self-described American liberalism. And it is American liberalism that cannot find a way to speak in patriotic terms whilst also going on with its international project. Whereas French liberalism finds it perfectly possible to reconcile the liberal project as they see it, which is undoubtedly different from the liberal project as the American left see it, with the idea of patriotic feeling. Now, this is something that is exceptionally important, because if France and the French Republic is seen, and I think it should be seen, to rightly be able to withstand many of the assaults, virtual and real, that are happening against it at the moment, if France is seen to be able to assert that, then this very much changes the game. Because then this isn't just Visegrad countries, for instance, in which patriotic feeling is something that is not only successful at the ballot box, but legitimate in civilized and decent society, but something that is so in France as well. In other words, what we might be seeing finally is a rollback of the strange way in which, in all of our lifetimes, the extension of the German revulsion of patriotic sentiment for very obvious historic reasons was spread out across Europe. Perhaps that spreading out is now to some extent coming back in, and people are finding the pendulum swinging back, as they say quite rightly, that there are totally acceptable and reasonable forms of patriotic feeling, which the peoples of countries, or all of our countries, have not just a right, but in some cases also a duty to feel, and that there's nothing wrong with it. So I see a change and a shift, which is a very stimulating and not by any means, out of date idea.
Yes, both realities coexist. The globalization is a very important and deep and quick trend, but patriotism, the need and the reality of the homeland, also remains essential for everyone's daily life. So both realities exist. The real question is how can we avoid destroying the homeland? How can globalization, mondialization, be in some extent realized without destroying the primary political and social reality that is the homeland? So we shall not, see those two realities as necessarily opposed, but we should find ways so that the primary needed community that is the homeland be preserved. People are in need of these deep-rooted communities to live in and to accomplish themselves. Nobody can accomplish himself in a kind of global, virtual, worldwide world conception. So I would not be so much pessimistic. I really think that there is more and more a desire to reinforce local, real, natural communities in order to make our existence less virtual and more resistant.
To tell the truth, the real conflict is between globalism and localism. This is a clash of worldviews that the mainstream press misleadingly characterizes as a conflict between the so-called college-educated intelligentsia and the deplorables, the narrow-minded rednecks, so to speak. It is, in truth, when people from anywhere come face to face with people from somewhere. The secular universalism of globalization recognizes only humanity and strives to create a global, unified structure. There is a, shall we say, institutional aspect to this aspiration, which we might as well call federalism or supranationalism. The gist of this approach is that it prefers legal and political processes as well that lead to the erosion of the foundations of the nation-state with the ultimate aim of diluting sovereignty in a sea of international institutions. And furthermore, this worldview gets support from postmodern progressivism, which wishes to deconstruct all physical and social obstacles to wish fulfillment. All this in order to create a boundless world. And the tangible aspect of this ideological struggle is the relativization of the Judeo-Christian foundations of the Western civilization, the minimization of the importance of national identities, and of course the promotion of multiculturalism and gender ideology. However, no matter how much the effort the globalists put into lionizing the image of the cosmopolitan citizen of the world, in reality, at least in my estimation, a person cannot be at home everywhere or anywhere in the world. Nobody can be torn out of time and space. We all need a place to call home.
Well, Mr. Murray talked in his keynote speech about how history is now in the middle of a culture war in the United States. This is something we know very well in Hungary. In our country, there is a strong tendency in some progressive globalist circles to look at our history in almost exclusively negative terms, focusing on the negative events and usually completely taken out of historical context. So I'm asking all the panelists, do you feel that there is a globalist narrative in the interpretation of history in your country? And is it trying to erase or rewrite the past to underline a political agenda?
100%. That is that's absolutely part of the tactic, because in order to convince people to give up the things that they know and that they like and the traditions of their people and of their place and of their families, you have to tell a story that says that all the things that have come before have been bad. And basically, it's a very conscious project to deprive people of their collective memories, of their histories, and to tear those things down. And they have to do that because they want to replace the old order with something new, with this sort of globalist ideology that supposedly is going to lead to some sort of a utopia, but really it's just a cover for very large multinational corporations and for transnational government to take power away from the broad middle class, away from that sort of class of people that grew up, starting in the early pre-modern era into the early modern era, and it was the basis for popular government. And that's all being torn down now, and it's being torn down in a very determined way to take away people's religion, tell them that's bad, take away people's love for and trust in their family and friends, and then you replace it with what? With this globalist ideology, which really is just consumerism. It's materialism. It's unfulfilling. And what's happened is that it's a very unnatural way for people to live, and they're starting to push back on it.
It's unbelievable how the media especially speaks badly of patriotism and describe everyone who is against mass immigration as xenophobic. And unfortunately, the tendency also exists in Switzerland. It is the bad intention of the left to portray our past negatively and to ignore our successes. The future needs a past. Only when we know from where we come, we can align the compass correctly. History must be taught seriously and truthfully, especially in school. It doesn't hurt to portray one's own deeds in a more glorious way.
Here we are in another pendulum question, aren't we? We all know that it's possible to teach history in a jingoistic, patriotic, and biased in one direction way. I don't at all doubt that all of our countries have at different times engaged in that. I think every country does. Publics like to think well of themselves, governments like to portray their actions in a good light, and governments, what's more, in charge of education, like to be able to show that there are common aspirations and achievements that the citizenry can draw upon in times of crisis. And after all, we've been in a time of crisis this year, and drawing on national feeling, patriotic belonging, responsibility, for instance, to the health service and much more are good wellsprings to draw upon. There's nothing innately wrong about them at all, far from it. They're one of the most important societal reserves. But as I say, I don't doubt that historically all of our countries have had what in Britain we describe as our island story versions of history, which gloss around certain, less good aspects of our history and play up some of the more glorious aspects. There's nothing that surprising about that happening. It's common throughout, I think, all countries and histories. What we've been through in recent decades is, however, the opposite, and there is something very unusual about that. There is something very unusual indeed about teaching people to feel guilt, and indeed unalloyed guilt. That's the thing, not a measured attitudes towards the past, but actually teaching guilt. Now, again, I stress, this is something that in America is particularly prominent and has become particularly prominent in recent years. And if I could give an example, one from the US and one from the UK that I think are particularly pertinent. The one from the US is this: the invention by the New York Times of something called the 1619 Project, which many of us here will be aware of. The 1619 Project is an ongoing, allegedly journalistic project, which is no such thing actually, that won a Pulitzer Prize immediately, founded by the New York Times, which in its stated aims, although they've now silently erased these stated aims, which is a sinister development, in their stated aims, the 1619 Project said that they wished to change the date of the founding of the American Republic to 1619. The foundational date of America would be 1619, because this was the date when the first slaves were brought into the American continent from the African continent. Now, this is, first of all, an extraordinary rewriting of history. Nobody, I think, could possibly deny or have an interest really in denying the horrors of the global slave trade, a trade which was partaken in by every civilization in history until our own abolished it in the 19th century. Now, this project, however, tries to completely rewrite the American past. It's not about the founding fathers. It's about a country born in sin, born in evil. And this is one of the clearest doctrinal changes of our time. Something which, in my opening comments earlier, I marked upon Donald Trump's Mount Rushmore speech. Was clearly a very important attempt to try to push back against the 1619 narrative. But I stress this because a version of this is going on in my own country, and I believe is going on in other countries as well. In my own country, you can hear it in particular, as in America, in the wake of the so-called Black Lives Matter movement, the highly politicized BLM movement. And the BLM movement, it's spilt out into the UK, seeks similarly to rewrite British involvement in the slave trade, so that the principal achievement of Britain in this, which was not just to get into enormous debt, not just abolishing slavery, but actually policing the seas in order to try to stop slavery in other countries where it was ongoing. Whereas this had previously been the great achievement of the Royal Navy and of the British state in the early 19th century. This was all turned around so that the principal achievement of Britain becomes Britain was a slave state. And now we see the demands for, including among other things, reparations to the descendants of people alleging they are the descendants of slaves. We see major institutions, universities, including Cambridge University, being audited by, I think, race hucksters to try to work out what they benefited from in the slave trade and how they might pay it back. So you see here an entire toxification of the history. And yes, I'm willing to say that at some stage we may have taught a jingoistic version of the history, but to go to exactly the opposite end and teach a self-hatred history is a quite extraordinary phenomenon. And something I'm certain that the pendulum again on this will right, but it's going to need an awful lot of pushing.
Of course, yes, there are various reasons for that. The most important reason is that ideology does not really like truth. And if you are a proponent of an ideology, often you sacrifice the truth in order to support your ideology. And many people who have such ideologies want to erase or to transform the historical truth at the service of their ideology. So the tendency to use history in order to destroy the reputation of a country, for example, or the reputation of churches, or the Catholic Church in particular, is obvious. And it is dishonest. It is clearly dishonest. It is a real problem at school, in school curriculum. But we can also observe it, for example, in Turkey. You know, in a country like Turkey, if you look to the school books of history, the way they present, the Ottoman Empire, the way they present the relationship with Armenians, the genocide of Armenians, the way they present the Christians' heritage in this country, is also deeply dishonest in a term of intellectual and historical accuracies. In France, we may also underline another aspect, is the fact that the French regime, République, tends to keep secret a large extent of its own history during the French Revolution. You know, Solzhenitsyn said that the first genocide started in France during the French Revolution, where the French members of parliament of the convention decided to exterminate part of the French population because they were Catholics and reluctant to the ideas of the French Revolution. And we had hundreds of thousands of people exterminated in the Vendée. And this aspect of the French history is really a kind of taboo in France. So yes, history is at the center of the cultural fight, but more generally, truth is at the center of cultural fight because people really are ready to sacrifice truth in order to promote their ideology. What is very important, I think, when for a conservative person, is to keep this fundamental love of honesty. We need to stay decent, and intellectually decent, and to respect and keep strongly with historical and legal honesty. Otherwise, we would be lost really in the ideological battles.
The Black Lives Matter movement and the violent hysteria it generated is terrifying, pure and simple. It shocks our conscience. But mercifully, this general rejection of the past and history, born of a cult of self-flagellation, political correctness, and the so-called quest for social justice, has so far left Hungary relatively untouched. There is, of course, some political debate when it comes to history, but so far the postmodern left hasn't yet dared take aim, whether theoretically or physically, at the founding symbols of the Hungarian nation and statehood, such as the Hungarian conquest of the homeland, the establishment of the Hungarian state, Saint Stephen, and our courageous struggles for independence. But to tell the truth, we must stress the yet part, because the ideology of cancel culture, trigger warnings, or safe spaces that has become so entrenched in the West knows no limits. And it is an undeniable fact that Hungarian history too was largely created and recorded by white, heterosexual Christian men. And in the ideas of the New Left, that alone is a crime worthy of punishment in the form of posthumous humiliation and eradication from the pages of history. In this region, we are of course familiar with this trend, as it was one of the distinguishing signs of communism.
Globalists tend to be convinced that only stronger global governance can solve such global issues as climate change. Global challenges require global solutions up to a degree for sure, but is it possible to be a patriot and a globalist at the same time on issues like climate change?
You know, these are these so-called what some people have started to call hyper projects, meaning they're projects that you can't really see. They're projects that sort of exist only in people's minds. So global warming or climate change is definitely one of those, and that's not a way of saying that it does or doesn't exist. It's a way of saying that it's such a large project, such a large undertaking to deal with. That it's really hard for anybody to get their minds around the entire problem and the entirety of any potential solution. And so, you know, when you come back and you think about, well, look, we do have as people, we have these large challenges that or problems that we need to deal with. How do we do that, and sort of how do we map that onto the idea of having a nation and having a sovereign national government? I think it's pretty straightforward that the answer is, of course, we can do that, but we have to always be respectful of what our capacity is in regards to coming up with solutions and actually executing those solutions in a meaningful way. So even if you compare Hungary and the United States when it comes to issues regarding the environment, to me the best thing that either country can do is to focus on what's going on within their own borders. In other words, what can we actually control? The idea that the United States can control everything that's going on on the planet, even if the cause is good, even if the cause is worthwhile, I think is just it's fruitless. It just isn't true. And so, to the extent that we see these large issues, it's a matter of national governments coordinating with each other, not of transnational, national, or supranational governments taking that authority away from the national governments.
No, of course, for example, the climate change, if there is any human influence on it, can only be solved globally. But it is wrong to practically force small countries to give up their industry, while China, for example, blows out Switzerland's entire CO2 exchange in one working day. So, but if you think you can stop climate change, you also believe you can stop the Earth from turning. It is, of course, possible to be a patriot and a globalist at the same time, but only if both terms are lived positively. Your country always comes first. That's the bloody duty of any government.
This is a very interesting question. I'd say two things. The first is, of course, that in terms of climate change, we know that countries can act without having to take a globalist route, because we know that America has been acting on things like CO2 emissions in recent years, despite withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords. Now, the Paris Accords are, of course, seen by many fans of globalization as the absolute epitome, indeed the masterclass of what a globalist solution might be to what would undoubtedly be regarded as a global problem. But yes, of course, it's clear that countries, first of all, can act, if not unilaterally and patriotically in this regard, in several ways. I mean, of course, they can act for the bad. I would point to a country like China, for instance, in this regard. A country like China can do the wrong things, and there is no realistic globalist punishment for a country like China acting in the way it does as a global polluter. And I think this shows us, as it were, one of the negative issues of globalization, which I pointed to before, which is, for instance, what is the court that punishes meaningfully a country which pollutes in the way that China does? But the second thing of that is, of course, as America has shown since withdrawing from the Paris Accords, it can go its own way, and it can, as it has in certain aspects, improve its policies to a greater extent than it would have done in its commitments to the Paris Accord. The second thing is, of course, is that fans of globalist answers, globalization answers to everything, do tend to want every problem to have a globalist solution. And I think this is a big mistake, in the same way that you might say that, we might agree, for instance, that there are national solutions to problems, and there will have to be global solutions, or I would rather say multinational solutions to problems. I think very few people deny that. But why every problem should have a globalist answer isn't any clearer to me than why every problem would have a national answer. And on this, we've, of course, in 2020 lived through a very interesting experiment, because aspects of the coronavirus do require a global response. I think, for instance, the clearest global response will be making sure that China pays a price, a real price, for what it has done in, for the third time in a year, releasing a pandemic across the globe and covering up, including covering up and corrupting international bodies like the World Health Organization, in order to make sure that we didn't learn at the stage that we should have learned exactly what China, for all sorts of reasons that themselves need to be looked into and have not been and probably will not be because of Chinese interference in international bodies and threatening of other countries and much more, but perhaps that's something for another occasion. Nevertheless, clearly there will be some international answers that will be needed to this. But obviously we have also lived through an era where patriotic or national answers are exactly what we have gone through. In my own country, in the United Kingdom, it was exceptionally striking to me that at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, we were talking in national terms about how to get through this. And there's nothing wrong in that. We were drawing as a country, as Hungary drew as a country, and as every other country did, on patriotic sentiment to try to see us through. Now, I would stress that maybe the one country this didn't happen in, I should say, is America, where because it was an election year, there was absolutely no moment where the corona issue was not seen through the presidential race lens. However, in a country like Britain, we did draw on well springs of patriotism to, for instance, protect the National Health Service. That was absolutely a unifying issue for the country. And the resources we drew upon to sustain ourselves through what was an unusual, and has for all of us been an unusual and demoralizing in many ways year, were patriotic wells. The British people wanted to hear from Her Majesty the Queen. And Her Majesty the Queen was the figure who was able to draw on the patriotic wells and to say to the people things we needed to hear to get through them. So we have had in 2020 a very interesting reminder of the fact that, yes, there may be issues, there may well be questions, there certainly will be in the years ahead, which will require some kind of global answers. But to think that this is an either or, and that global answers must preclude the possibility of any patriotic feeling or patriotic answers to questions, is to ignore one of the few lessons we should have learned from 2020, which is that when things go badly wrong, you need to draw on your deepest wells of feeling, and that patriotism is among the deepest ones you can draw upon. And just as it can go wrong, in a year like 2020, it's also shown us all where it can go right and should go right.
So yes, of course, it is possible. There are various levels of good. There is, the good, the personal good, the good of the family, the common good of the family, the common good of your homeland, of your country. And there is also a more global or universal common good. So there are various common goods, and of course, no common good can be contrary to another one. Common goods are always imbricated, which means that the national common good is part of the universal common good, as well as the personal and family common good is part of the national common good. The problem, the risk now, is more on the issue of subsidiarity. There is a problem when the states take over the responsibilities of the families. As well, there is a problem when the international level takes over the responsibilities of the states. So the real issue is the organization of the power, the repartition of the responsibilities. And if we want to have a good organization, each level have to defend its primary and natural responsibilities against any attempt from the superior level to withdraw and confiscate those responsibilities.
One of the most effective tricks globalists have played on all of us is to offer solutions to problems they themselves have created. And all in the name, of course, of empathy, solidarity, and humanity. First, they questioned and undermined our religious traditions and have come to offer esoteric quasi-faith and identity politics instead of true spirituality. Second, they are trying to deconstruct the sanctity of the family that has stood as a cornerstone of Western civilization for millennia. And for the inevitable demographic problems, now they offer migration as a solution. And they are the ones promoting now endless consumption as a way of life, despite knowing that it leads to limitless overproduction and puts unbearable burdens on nature. And now their proposed remedy is global eco-hysteria and climate anxiety, as if they had nothing to do with creating the problem in the first place.
Attila, köszönjük szépen! A panel után szeretném a te véleményedet is megkérdezni a témában. Az első kérdésem az lenne, hogy látsz-e feszültséget a hazafiasság és a globalizáció között? Lehet-e valaki hazafi és kozmopolita egy időben, vagy van esetleg egy olyan természetes határa ennek az érzésnek, ami országokhoz vagy szülőföldhöz kötődik? Te hogy látod?
Feszültség egyértelműen van, hogyha megnézzük az elmúlt néhány évet, és nem csak Magyarországon, nem csak Európában, hanem elsősorban az Egyesült Államokban, hogy mi történt. Láthatjuk azt, hogy nagyon komoly belső feszültségek vannak országokon belül. Én azt gondolom, hogy ezek egy része alapvetően természetes, hogyha arra gondolunk, hogy vannak alapvetően globális kérdések, amelyeket mindenképpen globálisan kell kezelni, ilyen például a klímaváltozás, erről a panelben is beszéltünk, akkor látjuk, hogy azért a globalistáknak is van igazsága, de nem mindenre megoldás a globalizmus. Viszont van egy nagyon türelmetlen mainstream agenda, hogy angol szavakat használjak, amely egész egyszerűen nem veszi legitimnek a úgymond patriótább érzelmeket, a hazához való ragaszkodást, egy kicsit a régmúlt maradványának tartja. És én azt látom, hogy elmentünk már egy utopikus gondolkodás irányába globális szinteken, és ez okozza ezt a nagyon komoly feszültséget, ami sokkal komolyabb annál egyébként, mint amit gondoltam volna.
És főleg a fiatalok körében a kozmopolita világszemlélet az egyre népszerűbbé válik. Te hogy látod, lehet egyszerre valaki kozmopolita is és hazafi is?
Hát ugye mit jelent az, hogy kozmopolita világpolgár? Én azt gondolom, hogy lehet egyszerre valaki világpolgár, érezheti magát jól a világ bármely pontján, és teljesen én elfogadom azt, ha valaki úgy gondolja, hogy ő bárhol ugyanolyan jól érzi magát. De én azt gondolom, hogy lehet valaki úgy világpolgár, tarthatja úgy fontosnak a közös kérdéseket, a közös mindannyiunkat érintő kérdéseket, hogy közben a saját hazáját egy picit fontosabbnak tartja. Ez nem bűn. Az a baj, hogy bűnt próbálnak belőle csinálni. Ismétlem, nagyon-nagyon rossz történelmi időszakokat idézesz fel, különösen olyan országokban, mint közép-európai országok, Magyarország, hiszen láttuk azt, hogy úgymond a progresszivitás a fejlődés jegyében nem csak, hogy hátrányos helyzetbe hoztak embereket, mondjuk akár 1919-ben vagy 1947 után Magyarországon, hanem az életükbe került úgymond a nem eléggé nagy progresszivitás, meg nem az eléggé nagy nyitottság a jövőre. Tehát látok ebben egy komoly problémát, és ugyanakkor nem látom azt, hogy ne lehetne ezt feloldani. És most még mondok egy példát, tehát nyilván fontos a hazafiasság, fontos saját magunkban gondolkodni. Éppen minapi hír az, hogy közel 90%-a vagy 85-90%-a a Magyarországra érkező légszennyezésnek az Lengyelországból és Romániából jön. Tehát ne beszéljünk csak a globális klímaváltozásról. Egy ilyen viszonylag egyszerű kérdésről. Persze, hogy nem tudunk mindent megoldani országon belül, persze, hogy fontos nagyobb méretekben is gondolkodni, mint Magyarország, vagy Lengyelország, vagy akár mint az Egyesült Államok, még az Egyesült Államok se tud mindent megoldani, de ez a nagyobb méretben gondolkodás nem jelentheti azt, hogy feladjuk identitásunkat, mert globális identitás nincs. Az ember pedig alapvetően közösségi lény. Ha az identitását elveszik, legyen az vallás, nemzet, a csoport identitását elveszi, és csupán egyénekbe gondolkodunk, és sajnos a globalista, ultraliberális, progresszívek alapvetően egyénekbe gondolkodnak, akkor az emberi létnek egy nagyon fontos aspektusát vesszük el.
És említetted, hogy szerinted van feszültség a globalista és a patrióta szemlélet között. Itt szeretném behozni a híres szerző Samuel Huntington sokat idézett a Civilizációk összecsapása című cikkét, amiből utána később könyvet is írt. Itt ugye azt állítja, hogy a hidegháborút követően a konfliktusok elsősorban civilizációs határokon fognak kitörni. Azt szeretném kérdezni, hogy te hogy látod, hogy ezt a jelenleg globalisták és a patrióták között feszülő ellentét, ez mennyire súlyos? El tudod képzelni, hogy a közeljövőben ezek mentén alakul ki az egyik legkomolyabb törésvonal?
Én nem gondoltam volna, hogy ennyire súlyos egyébként. 1993-ban még egyetemistaként rohantam be a könyvtárba, hogy elolvassam a Huntington cikket, rendkívül érdekesnek találtam, ugye, és ebből a cikkből lett egy egész könyv, a Clash of Civilization. És azt gondolom, hogy a Huntingtoni forgatókönyv egy része megvalósult, tehát igenis látható, hogy van azért feszültség az iszlám és Európa között, vannak feszültségek Kína és az Egyesült Államok között, és ezeknek egy része az civilizációs, kulturális, és nem csak geopolitikai okú. Tehát azt gondolom, hogy valid a Huntingtoni érvelés egy része is, de a világ az rendkívül bonyolult hely, tehát nem egy, és még egy olyan nagy hatású, meg nagy tudású szerző se látott előre mindent, mint Huntington, vagy akár mondjuk akkor Francis Fukuyamát, tehát az ő globális utópiája sem látszik megvalósulni. Tehát azt lehet látni, hogy nagyon sok törésvonallal teli most a világ, jóval több törésvonallal teli, mint az elmúlt 3 évtizedben bármikor. És ez gond. És az egyik törésvonal, az tényleg a úgymond globalista, patrióta törésvonala, de van ugyanakkor törésvonal civilizációk között is. Tehát mind a kettő egy létező jelenség, mind a kettő egy nagyon problematikus jelenség, és mind a kettő meglehetősen pessimistává tesz a jövővel kapcsolatban. Annyira kiéleződtek ugyanis ezek a konfliktusok, országokon belül elsősorban, tehát a globalista patrióta az alapvetően országokon belüli konfliktus, annyira kiéleződtek, hogy nehéz látni a feloldását. Tehát nézzük meg az Egyesült Államokat, elvesztette a középosztály azt a reményt, hogy a jövő jobb lesz. És ez részben a globalizációnak köszönhető, kiszervezték az amerikai ipar jelentős részét Kínába. Most, ha visszahozzák Kínából az amerikai ipart, az nyilván óriási feszültséget fog kelteni Kína és az Egyesült Államok között. Hát nincs jó megoldás. Tehát az amerikai középosztálynak a kvázi szenvedése az megjelent az amerikai választásokban is. Tehát ha azt nézzük, hogy Trump micsoda ellenszéllel szembe kapott több mint 70 millió szavazatot, akkor megtaláljuk már a választ. Tehát nyilván nem Trump elnöknek a hihetetlen, néha nem túl jó kommunikációs készségei hozták el ezt az eredményt, hanem az, hogy megszólított olyan rétegeket, akiket más nem szólított meg, akik alapvetően a globalista, progresszív irány nem igazán tud megfogni magának, azért nem, mert a bőrükön érzik a negatívumokat. Tehát nyilván sokkal könnyebb globalistának lenni, ha valaki a manhattani felhőkarcoló 89. emeletén él egy penthouse-ban, és neki jó az, hogy a takarítónőtől kezdve az egész kiszolgáló személyzet valamelyik harmadik világbeli országban jön, és féláron megcsinálja azt, amit az amerikaiak kétszeres áron csinálnának meg. És ez ugyanez igaz Európára is. Tehát van egy olyan elit, aki csak a jót látja ebben, de van egy olyan nagyon széles réteg, aki azt látja ebben, hogy elvesztettem a munkámat, vagy azt látja, hogy a külvárosban egy rövid szoknyáért rám szólnak azok, akik egy más kultúrkörből jöttek, és akkor itt utalok Huntingtonra, és nem igazán, és nem felelős azért az se, aki mondjuk Szomáliából egy hagyományos környezetből ide került. Tehát én nem mondom azt, hogy ők rosszak. Ez egy más kultúra, és nehéz adaptálódni egy európai kultúrába. És nem is biztos, hogy lehet, különösen akkor, hogyha ez egy ilyen ördögi körré áll össze, hogy egy bevándorló ugye kapja a negatív visszacsatolásokat, ugye a többségi közösségtől, a többségi közösség szintén kapja a negatív visszacsatolásokat, ezt látjuk Franciaországban. Ez történik. Tehát a kérdésedre azt mondanám, hogy mind a két kérdés az probléma. Ugye probléma a civilizációs különbségek kérdés, és ez nem olyan könnyen feloldható, mint szerintem az antropológiai optimisták, vagy az antropológiai utopisták gondolják, akik alapvetően azt gondolják, hogy az emberek ugyanolyanok, nem mert nagyon nagy mértékben hat ránk a kultúránk, és mondom a csoportunkhoz való tartozás, de azt mondanám, hogy tehát nagyon nehéz ebből az ördögi körből kikerülni. Összességében Huntingtonnak is igaza volt, és azoknak is igaza volt, hogy Huntington nem látja a teljes valóságot.
Köszönöm szépen! Bízom benne, hogy nézőink számára is tanulságos volt a mai beszélgetés. Szeretettel várjuk Önöket jövő héten a Patriotic Talks 5., egyben utolsó alkalmán. A karácsony közelettével záró beszélgetésünk témája a keresztény zsidó örökségünk és annak védelme. Szép estét, viszontlátásra!